Hello, and welcome to today's Is It Starting? Possibly an FP-5 strike on the arms industry. Ukraine Situation Report. 550, go. We'll discuss recent events in Ukraine as the war nears its fourth year.
That's less than 24 hours to get there now.
In Ukraine, the fighting, of course, continues along the front. But from the looks of it, Ukraine probably used the FP-5 in a certain way for the first time yesterday, just as others, and I myself, had imagined the deployment.
There are many indications of this right now, namely against the Russian arms industry, against high-value targets, and far, far behind the front lines.
We will take a look at what is known about this so far. Of course, the details are not yet fully available.
Otherwise, of course, we will also talk about what has happened along the front, as well as what has happened behind it. Afterwards, as always, there will be a Q&A session. I can somehow imagine that today it will be less about Ukraine and more about the Middle East. But of course, we can also address that in the Q&A session. And afterwards, there will be no Twitch stream today. I'm going to take it easy and relax a bit, because I think I'll have to work overtime again in the near future.
You know what that means. But I'd say, let's start the situation report right away.
Holy cow, now with my code. Save the most with Holy. And of course, the 24th is not the 22nd.
My birthday is right around that time, and that was on my mind during the introduction. We'll start first with Ukrainian attacks on Russian industry. Here we have an attack on the oil infrastructure in Pskov. Once again, Russian industry was hit there. A gas facility in Samara was struck, and then this happened. We have an attack on an arms industry, a factory where various missiles are produced, including Iskander. And apparently, parts for the Oreshnik are being produced there, so this is high-quality Russian arms industry. And you can hear something interesting in the recordings if we listen to it briefly. The farmers, Boa,
I think you could just hear it. And I hope that the Russian swearing hasn't led to another penalty from Google, because that tends to happen when you use too many swear words.
As you could clearly hear, there was a significant jet engine sound.
And we're talking about a bigger one. I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but I've heard enough airplanes.
That didn't sound like a small attack drone, like an engine used in some model airplanes, but rather it would fit something like an L-39, for example.
And as you know, the FP-5 is equipped with military engines. So those are the clues, and there are corresponding explanations as well.
All of this is 1,400 kilometers away from the Russian border, away from the front. And then here we have the co-founder of the company. And he posts this video. Here's a short video without context. The context will follow later. And he posts this after the impacts have occurred.
Now, of course, we can put two and two together. That alone isn't an explanation. It's not a final confirmation, but it certainly points to a lot. We've talked several times about the FP-5. The lack of deployments was due to a successful Russian attack on the manufacturing industry and infrastructure.
But the Ukrainians said they rebuilt it, and in a place that is probably safer, so we can assume that this was possibly the first deployment.
Further in the rear area against the arms industry, of course there were previous deployments, but those were against launch facilities for the Oreshnik, for example, or against closer targets.
Now we're talking about the strategic arms industry being attacked, because the destruction of such a factory is on a completely different level, and now it seems that missiles have arrived there. At this point, nothing is known yet about the current extent of the damage.
We'll have to wait for satellite images or footage from the scene. But from the looks of it, the FP-5 is more than just vaporware. Apparently, there have been more operations in this regard. And if we are to believe the Ukrainians, there will probably be more in the future.
Then we have one.
a leak where the Russian General Minister Major Roman Demurshiv boasts about being involved in the torture. That is, how he is partly responsible for the torture and murders of Ukrainian prisoners of war. He is the commander of the 20th Maisinkhod's army, in which he does so in the leak. He also complains about the Chechens, for example, about the Federal Security Service, and about the Russian military itself. But he also boasts about how Ukrainian prisoners of war were tortured and murdered, which once again shows that the knowledge about Russian war crimes reaches all the way to the top. We continue with the developments along the front, and there we start in the Sumi region. There, the Russians have crossed the border north of the previous combat zone, northwest of Rilsk. Here at this point, that was an infiltration. At this moment, it is not apparent that the Russians have established themselves here. But we can see here in Kharkivka that there were Russian soldiers there. Further south from there, we have the Russians at Kindrativka, and there they were captured, so they were defeated there. But we do have Russian troops who have entered Kindrativka, which probably means that the eastern part of the settlement should slowly be considered a gray zone, and is likely no longer under firm Ukrainian control. That's it from the Kupiansk region, from the Sumi region. We're moving on towards Vovchansk, and there we have a fresh confirmation. Ukrainian presence in the settlement of Prilipka here. Geolocated, at this spot, Ukrainian positions are being shelled there. Maybe a bit too much to say for now. The Ukrainians have it under control, but it at least still shows Ukrainian presence in Prilipka. Whether this was a successful attack by the Ukrainians, or whether the Ukrainians held out there the whole time, can't be said based on this. But we know we have confirmation that the Russians definitely do not control Prilipka. East of there, towards Veliki Boluk, the Russians have entered Chuhunivka. Here at this spot, we have geolocated them in the eastern part of Chuhunivka, which is roughly at this location. So here, Russian soldiers were able to enter the village. Further southeast, towards Kupiansk, we have the Ukrainians operating in Kupiansk. There, they are continuing to work slowly. They are continuing to push back the last Russian positions within Kupiansk, especially now that the thawing weather is making it even harder to cross the Oskil, because for a while the Russians were able to cross the Oskil on the ice. That is probably no longer possible now. And now we have a geolocation here. Russian soldiers were captured there, and that's at this location. So within the area of Kupiansk that was most recently considered to be under Russian control. However, southeast of there, the Russians have been seen at a new position, namely here at Kucherivka. Probably an infiltration. The Russians recently broke through to the south here, but now there's a geolocation at this spot. Russian presence, which shows us that the map in this region is probably not entirely accurate. The contested area here definitely seems to be larger than what the deep steppe map shows us here. That's it. From the direction of Kupiansk towards Borowa and Liman, we have no changes. That means we can go directly south of the Oskil, towards Sloviansk. And there we have the Russians west of Minikivka. Here at this point, the Russians have advanced further to the west. We have them here to the east of it, or on the western edge of Minikivka. That should be about here, at this point. That means they are slowly approaching Kramatorsk from the east. If we roughly measure it, it's only 18.5 kilometers to the center of Kramatorsk. That means it's well within the range of first-person view drones. That will likely make the situation for the Ukrainians in Sloviansk and Kramatorsk even more difficult. That's all from this region. I can't document any changes in Kostiantynivka. In Dobropilya, the Russians were attacked west of Rodinska. That's what we have here. The Russians are now operating directly west of the village. I think it must have been here. We can see that there as well. The deep state map already marks it as contested. We can confirm that. And regarding the Pokrovsk region, we have the Ukrainians carrying out a counterattack in Rizhine. Here in the south, we can see that's where the Ukrainians are attacking.
And the interesting thing is, we have a video of it. That's a Leopard 2 operating there and engaging in close combat. And this is another video where we can see how both sides use their combat vehicles differently.
The main reason for this is probably quite simple. The Russians are advancing mainly with infiltration attacks.
And as I have described in the past, the soldier has to carry everything he has with him, including clothing.
We have now talked about the challenging weather, that he has to protect himself with it in the winter.
He has to bring food and water, but he also has to bring ammunition. It's simply not possible for him to carry significant anti-tank weapons. He can't carry unlimited amounts.
And we see here that in this way, it once again allows the Ukrainians to practically engage in close combat. And in this way, to use the Leopard 2 at very close range to actively engage Russian positions. That's what happened from the direction of Pokrovsk towards Rishine. But we also have a change from Udakina. And this is also remarkable, because Udachina was actually held by the Russians, but now we suddenly have Russian attacks on Ukrainian positions in the west of Udachina. At this point here, it's obvious that the Ukrainians have been successful with a counterattack, because the idea that Ukrainians have held out here the entire time can't be completely ruled out these days. But it seems pretty unlikely. So was it obviously a smaller counterattack towards Udakina that was successful on the Ukrainian side? Because as I said, we have a geolocation here from the western edge of the village. That was it, towards Pokrovsk. The next change we have is towards Pokrovsk down here.
And there, the Russians were defeated by the Ukrainians in Orestopil up here.
We have geolocated that here, which at that moment means that they were defeated there. And if we look at the map, then it's here south of the river, so roughly at this spot. But that also means that the Russians at least temporarily advanced up to that point. Here too, we can see that the deep state map is accurate in this regard. The area is obviously contested now. South of that, towards Huliapole, we have another change from Salisnichna, which is west of Huliapole, right here at this point. And once again, the Ukrainians are victorious. They defeat Russian positions on the western edge of Salisnichna. However, interestingly, if we look at the map, here is the road, this one right here. That means the position was somewhere at this point, which in turn means that the Russians had advanced further west, at least temporarily, than we can see on the map. I can't record any major Ukrainian successes on the ground anymore. By the way, that's it for territorial changes as well. For now, that's exactly how it looks to me. It's as if the Ukrainian exploitation of Russian weakness in command and control, that is, in the control and leadership of their own forces, as if that exploitation is slowly coming to an end. We've talked in the past about how the Ukrainians were able to use the shutdown of Starlink for the Russians, especially in contested areas, to clear out Russian positions and thus recapture territory. But in my opinion, that was only a temporary advantage until the Russians were able to adapt and prevent further actions of this kind. At the moment, it looks like that point may have already been reached. Of course, we'll see in the coming days. Further Ukrainian attacks are possible, and more successes are also possible. The Russians also say that the situation is difficult in this regard because Ukrainian attacks are holding them back. But whether there will be further rolling back of Russian positions, I'm at least a bit skeptical. We'll simply have to wait and see how things develop there. So that's it for the changes. Overall, it seems as if the Ukrainian counterattacks towards Juliapole and Zaporizhzhia have passed their peak, if you will. But I don't want to make a final judgment there. Otherwise, the situation remains largely unchanged for the Ukrainians. Certainly the most unpleasant news is the increasing advance towards Kramatorsk from the southeast. That's a pretty unpleasant situation for the Ukrainians, but otherwise largely unchanged. The crossing of the border that we have here is not limited to this part. I've mentioned several times that the Russians have been doing this for some time now, and we can now see it on the deep state map as well. We don't just see this area. We now see this here, here, here. We see that the Russians are crossing the border at various points to put pressure on the Ukrainians, to spread them thin, to tie down Ukrainian troops and to split them up. This is partly also taking advantage of positions. We often have. That should be something like that too. Exactly. We often have villages that are located right on the border. In this way, the Russians can claim, "We have captured another village," even if that village was effectively only defended by drones. Because here in Ukraine, it's extremely unlikely that Ukrainian soldiers are sitting in such a border village. They are likely not defended for the most part, not actively with soldiers on the ground. But for the Russians, this allows them to announce another conquest. And that's something we've seen once again in the past few weeks. As for the consequences, even on the Russian side, the Russians themselves, the Russian mill bloggers themselves, say that this is a conquest on credit. That means sending a soldier who shows his flag and declares that a village has been captured, even if it's not actually under effective control. That would allow the officers to report a success, which is apparently sometimes even linked to immediate bonuses. The whole thing keeps getting reported up the chain.
And that's how you end up with grand statements claiming that a certain number of villages have been captured and a certain amount of territory has been taken within a specific period.
Meanwhile, more neutral sources often put the numbers at about half, and to some extent, that naturally leads to problems.
As we saw recently in Kupiansk, where the Ukrainians were able to prove that the supposed control over Kupiansk never really existed to that extent, and the Russians had completely overextended themselves there.
Personally, the whole thing kind of reminded me of those stories that pop up every few years. Whenever a bank goes bankrupt again, or is on the verge of bankruptcy because someone in the investment department speculated for the bank, lost, didn't want to report it to higher-ups, and then started playing with bigger stakes. And maybe the first 2 or 3 times it even worked out, that he was able to recover the losses with these counterbets. And because it worked the first time and the second time, it keeps going on and on.
You all know these stories. You will all remember having heard something like this before,
where suddenly a bank discovers 5 billion or more in losses that had previously disappeared through creative accounting. And at that moment, the banks collapse, and people are happy to spend many years behind bars. In this case, to some extent, this comparison came to my mind, because just as the bank employee doesn't report the losses, hides them to pretend he's highly successful, and instead keeps making the situation worse. It's the same, of course, when real difficulties along the front aren't properly reported up the chain. Then the leadership itself is operating based on a fundamentally different situation.
Let's assume the military leadership believes that Kupiansk is actually completely under Russian control, that they believe everything here is being held by the Russians.
If the Russian soldiers are actually here and need fire support, who do you tell that you need artillery fire here, since this is supposedly Russian-held territory? And how much ammunition is provided to the artillery that's back here and can only fire in this area? These are all things that can escalate, that can get worse. Even if I officially report on the maps that the area has been taken, it will become somewhat difficult to request glide bombs on that area. All these kinds of things can escalate if I have major successes, and then I might get less supplies, because there's a risk of overextension.
In reality, however, there have been fewer successes, and then you have to try to achieve the same successes you already reported, but with more limited resources. And so everything can escalate, and we see that here along the front, along the border. We saw it in Kupiansk, but also to some extent towards Juliapole and in the direction of Saborish.
Where the Ukrainians were able to take advantage of a collapse in Russian communication capabilities, then we have reports of sabotage in the area, if you will. The agents, the Ukrainians and Moldovans, were able to identify and arrest 10 people who were supposed to receive up to 100,000 United States dollars in total for the assassination of well-known Ukrainians. This included journalists, celebrities, and GUR employees. That means, on the Russian side, they wanted to recruit Ukrainians who would kill Ukrainian celebrities supporting the war on behalf of the main intelligence directorate. Then we have troop generation. On the Russian side, the Duma has passed a new law that can now be used against people who are against mobilizations. Here is the quote from the article. As Anatoly Vybomy, deputy chairman of the State Duma Committee on Security and Anti-Corruption,
previously explained in an interview with Russian information agency Novosti, the main goal of the initiative is to create conditions and shape public awareness accordingly, that the mere intention to evade the defense of the fatherland is perceived as socially unacceptable. That means, as I said, this is how it is from the Russian side. A strengthening of preventive measures against the distortion of historical truth and to curb the evasion of the duty to defend the fatherland is now being decided. It all sounds comprehensive, but it will ultimately depend on the individual verses and lines. But quite obviously, a distortion of historical truth is meant to be criticized, that is, punished. That means anyone who has a different view of history than the Russian government will be punished in the future, and at the same time, anyone who weakens the country's defense capability. Here, too, we have to some extent the concept of undermining military strength that comes up, and that, in turn, means that if a mobilization takes place and you protest against it, this law could be used against you. And in a previous video, I think it should be posted now, I showed you that the Kremlin has prepared the activation of the mobilization reserve. The Russians have a problem, but with millions of men in the country, we don't need to worry they'll run out. Of course, theoretically, the Russians have several, probably 10 or 15 million men in the country that they could use for the military. But the big question is, how do you get these men into uniform? The Russians mobilized in September 22, and that led to 700,000 Russians fleeing the country, most of whom have not returned, or many have not returned. And those were the better educated ones, which has worsened the labor shortage in Russia. In addition, the mobilized soldiers were never rotated, which means that anyone who is mobilized in the future knows that their only way out of this war is either a Russian victory, being maimed, or their own death, because there will be no more rotation. Therefore, instead of mobilizing new troops and rotating them, the Russian government has tried to meet its needs with volunteers. That worked for a while. However, large bonuses had to be paid for this. But by now, the bonuses are gigantic, and the quality of the volunteers is now completely inadequate. We've already discussed in the past that it was observed that at first the patriots came, then the criminals. And today, basically, it's the social outcasts who are coming. The drug addicts, the alcoholics, those who wouldn't be recruited under normal circumstances either. The health requirements have also been drastically reduced. And this is in a war that, near the front lines, now takes place almost exclusively, or at least largely, on foot. Can you imagine that this is another problem at this point? And in the long run, this is a problem for the Russians, because by now, most people in Russia have noticed it too. What happens to them when they sign the contract? That they receive hardly any training, and then, even if they were promised something else before, they are gladly sent to the infantry and assault units. On top of that, there are blackmail attempts by the superiors, who, if you don't pay them, send you to exactly these units and practically let you be killed by the Ukrainians. Deliberately. All these reports are slowly but surely reaching the population and are being noticed by them. In the long run, this will cause problems for the Russians with recruitment. And Russia will try to solve this in the long term by using the mobilization reserve. Ukraine has increased its arms production fivefold since the beginning of the invasion. Meanwhile, 50% of the demand is now covered by domestic production. For example, we remember the Bogdanas that the Ukrainians produce, an artillery gun that is mounted on a truck, making it self-propelled, but is now also produced as a towed version, especially the self-propelled Bogdanas are. If we are to believe the Ukrainian reports, they are now being produced more frequently than all other Western artillery systems combined. Mind you, and of course that's not limited to that. Drones are being added, which may soon be exported as well. Ukraine also talks about how it can make money this way, because it can, of course, use certain capacities it has. At first glance, it seems counterproductive and problematic when Ukraine, which is fighting for its survival, exports weapons. But of course, it has to be clear that if Ukraine produces weapons and can sell them at a profit, then it can use that money to buy other things. And then suddenly, it makes a lot of sense again. For example,
the Ukrainian weapons manufacturer Ford continues to export. That means you can buy sports pistols from Ukraine in some European countries, which were produced there during the war. But that sometimes helps finance the production of assault rifles by this very company. And suddenly, the whole thing makes a lot of sense. Now let's move on to the political side. As I said, when it comes to the negotiations, there's hardly any reason to mention them much, because not much is happening. Ukraine has repeatedly made significant concessions, while there is still no relevant concession to be seen from the Russian side, except for the fact that for the moment, they are not demanding the handover of the unoccupied parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson. But apart from that, there still isn't really any sign that the Russian side is making concessions in any significant way. And that also leads to a not very surprising article here at Reuters. There, representatives from 5 European intelligence agencies spoke to Reuters. And I'll quote a few parts from it. Russia is not seeking a peace agreement. It is pursuing its strategic goals. And these have not changed, explained one of the European intelligence chiefs. These include the removal of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and turning Ukraine into a neutral buffer state against the West. The main problem, according to a second intelligence chief, is that Russia neither wants nor needs a quick peace, and its economy is not on the verge of collapse. The second intelligence chief continued. 2 of the officials said Moscow is trying to steer the talks in 2 different directions. One focusing on the war. This concerns the talks with the Americans, and a second one focusing on bilateral agreements with the United States that would include an easing of sanctions against Russia. Zelensky said his intelligence chiefs informed him that the negotiators from the United States and Russia were discussing bilateral cooperation agreements worth up to $12 trillion. These had been proposed by the Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev. We've discussed this before, and I've brought it up here multiple times. It's clear that the Russians are trying to tell the Americans to give up on Ukraine by making their own offers. It's much more worthwhile to cooperate with us than to keep selling weapons to Ukraine. This has been discussed here repeatedly, also on the channel, and we see it confirmed again in another place. And then we have help coming from Sweden. Sweden is once again putting together a larger weapons package worth 12.9 billion kroner, which amounts to about 1.4 billion in total. And this includes Shorat, which is short-range air defense with ammunition. We're talking about 40mm ammunition. I'm not exactly sure what they're sending there. So, the Bofors, the classic Bofors with 40mm, exist both as a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun based on the CV-90, but it also exists as a regular stationary gun. It's been in use for decades. In its original version, it was even used in World War II, and apparently, they will continue to deliver it there. Which short-range air defense system exactly will be delivered wasn't clear to me from the article, but we can see that the Swedes are putting together another significant package.